As more and more chapters of Poppy Playtime come out, more and more mysteries about the lore get solved. But of course, each chapter opens new mysteries that's up to future chapters to solve. But there's no mystery quite like the protagonist of Poppy Playtime, also known as the player, and all the context clues around their identity and motivation that keep piling up after each chapter and continues to make us wonder what the whole deal with them is. Why did they come back? What do they feel guilty about? Who are they? How much about the evils of Playtime Co do they know about? These are all valid questions, so in this video, I'll be doing a deep dive on the most mysterious character of Poppy Playtime, the person we are playing as. We'll start off with one of the biggest mysteries about the player and the one that people are most eager to discover, their identity. This is the most theorized aspect about the player because it's the only character with all the screen time but we know nothing about them, despite hints about their past being everywhere. Many fans have even become frustrated that we're 5 chapters in and still don't know who we're playing as. So as expected, people would be theorizing heavily on who the player is, especially with the new clues that come with each chapter. In Chapter 1, we learnt that the player is an ex-employee. In Chapter 2, we learnt that the player was recognised by Mummy Longlegs. Similarly in Chapter 3, Mr. Light recognises the player's face and more importantly, Chapter 3 reveals that the player feels guilty about something that's likely related to Playtime Co. In Chapter 4, Harley Sawyer confirms that the player wasn't a face he recognises, so they likely weren't an executive or labs worker, and hinted to the fact that the player probably came back for a loved one who probably died in the hour of joy. Chapter 5 does some very interesting things with major theories on the player's identity, shutting down major theories like PW, who was confirmed to have died or be turned into an experiment some days after the hour of joy, leaving the Rich player theory in a make or break stance since the Chapter 5 Rich tape is about Leith and Eddie discussing making Rich an executive, which would destroy the theory since the player is not likely to have been an executive. But whether Rich accepted that promotion or left Playtime Co after it could either confirm Rich as a player or completely debunk it, especially since this tape took place in early August 1995, only days before the hour of joy. But this tape also added an unexpected candidate for the player, that being Eddie Ritterman. After Eddie and Leith finished talking about Rich, Eddie announces that he will be away from the factory from August 7th to August 12th, 1995, meaning that he was not at the hour of joy, just like we know the player wasn't there. But Eddie being the player is very unlikely. Eddie has Kennedy's disease, which makes limbs muscles become weaker over time, which can only mean that he wasn't well enough to do everything the player did, especially since Eddie is around 58 or 59 when Poppy Playtime takes place. I think that Mob intentionally put this lore drop in Chapter 5 so people wouldn't immediately jump to Eddie being the player after finding out that he also wasn't at the hour of joy. But there's no way they're going to put the bombshell that Eddie is alive out there, so I think that they're gonna do something with it, like spin-offs for the Tokyo factory or even the play park that Eddie missed the hour of joy to go inspect, both of which were mentioned in this VHS tape. Anyways, I got a bit distracted there. Do you know what else is distracting? The idea that the player has to be a character that's already well established. I've noticed that people are too caught up in the idea that the player has to be a character we know a lot about already, to the point that any theory about the player being a new person or an employee that's been mentioned in the past often gets discarded due to a lack of proof and stuff. But is it true that the player can only be one of these few well-established characters that many think are most likely to be the player? Well, let's see what the former director of Poppy Playtime, Isaac, has to say about the player's identity in the infamous Twitter Q&A after Chapter 5 came out. When asked about the player's identity, he reveals that they started out as a self-insert for the actual person playing the game, so up until Chapter 3's release, Mob never really thought about who should be the player. It wasn't until early Chapter 4 development that they realised that the player should probably have an identity and not just be a self-insert, though Isaac never stayed around long enough to decide who it should be, which makes it up to the new director now to decide who they are. So when we take into account many of the characters with lore before Chapter 4, even the ones many think are the player, it seems like it's less likely that these people will end up being the player. Let's take Rich for example. He's infamously had a VHS tape in every chapter where his story is clearly going somewhere, from a lower warehouse employee climbing the ranks to potentially an executive. It seems that since the start of the game's existence, they had an idea for where his story would go. But by the time Mob realised they should probably give the player an identity, Richard's story has been very likely fleshed out already and the ending of his story already established, which can only mean that he, much like these other characters with developing stories before Chapter 4, are actually less likely to end up being the player compared to any background or completely brand new characters. Of course, plans do change, like how the game was originally supposed to end at Chapter 5 but it extended to Chapter 6, so we do get a bonus rich tape and other employees' lore. So any of the fan declared top candidates for the player since the start of the game could end up being the player. So long as Mob scraps the original plans they had for them, which could be seen as something controversial, since there's always going to be fans who are resistant to change after they find out that the original plan was something else. But that's a conversation for another time. Now I think is a good time to address a crack theory many people believe. We know that the player has survived so much and can endure so much more than a person can realistically handle. Because of this, a lot of people think that the player is a toy, an experiment just like everyone they've encountered in this game. But this is pretty easy to disprove, like that moment in Chapter 4 where the Doctor himself blatantly calls the player a human. So with that line alone, the chances of the player being a toy is 0%. Time to pack it up, player toy theorists. But if that's not enough to convince you, the player went on to live 10 years outside of the factory. If a toy were to live outside the factory, they probably wouldn't last very long. They would need to live in isolation or the authorities would be alerted that there's a living life-size toy wandering among them. Like, how would they even get food outside of the very limited food delivery they had back then? That stuff is expensive too, so without any money, how would they even live? Assuming that Playtime Co didn't pay them enough to have proper savings because of the fact that they were a greedy company and that is what caused everything to happen in the first place. I know that all this could be brushed off as people just assuming that the player is a weirdo who wears a giant toy costume all the time, but come on, what are the chances? So if the player isn't a toy, how did they manage to do the things that seem impossible for a human to do? Well, basically, it's all in the grab pack. All the insane movements the player can pull off are not without help from the grab pack. Without it, they would have been killed many chapters ago. Out of the little information we have about the player, there's one thing that seems to be a huge theme about them, and that's their guilt. From the Home Sweet Home dream sequence in Chapter 3, they seem to be feeling guilty about something. Fans have come up with two main theories on what they could be feeling guilty about. 1. Survivor's guilt for being the only survivor of the Hour of Joy, and 2. Guilt for being involved with the experimentation of children. But honestly, I don't think any of these are the case. Now walk with me on this, because there are holes to both of these theories that I'll go over. So first, I'll explain why the player did not return due to survivor's guilt. Everything leads back to the letter they received that had them returning to the factory. The letter claims that the employees are still alive and hidden somewhere in the factory. These were the words that convinced the player to go back to the factory, to search for their missing co-workers and find out what happened to them and why they're still there. It means that they had no idea the Hour of Joy happened, and Chapter 3 basically confirms that with Poppy showing them the tape and that being how they found out that everyone's, in fact, dead and the letter was lying about the employees being alive. Therefore, the player could not have been experiencing survivor's guilt about the Hour of Joy prior to returning to Playtime Co. But let's say that they did know about the Hour of Joy. If this was the case, they would know immediately that the letter was fake and clearly trying to lure them into something dangerous. Reasonably, someone knowing that everyone was killed in a massacre at their old workplace, then getting a letter saying something that it was all fake and we're still alive, you should come back, would see this letter as malicious and, for their safety, would not go back. If the player's survivor's guilt made them return to the factory, I highly doubt that they would have waited a whole decade for a fake letter to return to the factory. They would have returned much sooner and on their own accord. I know that the doctor mentioned that it can't have just been a vague letter that brought them back, which could have been proof that the letter wasn't the main driving factor for the player's return to the factory, which could be proof of the survivor's guilt theory, but we'll get back to this later. Then there's a theory that the player's return was due to their guilt in turning children into experiments. This theory is a bit more solid than the survivor's guilt one, but there are some inconsistencies in this theory that makes it safe to assume that it's not true. The biggest one of these is the fact that everyone who has worked with the experiments are aware that they behave very aggressively very often. I think that 10 years is enough time for someone who knows about the experiments to put 2 and 2 together and realise that it's probably the very aggressive experiments that killed everyone. So with that information, I highly doubt that the player would dare to return, especially since their goal was to leave after encountering just one hostile experiment, which is proof that they probably didn't know about the experiments. But if that's the case, why do Mummy Longlegs and Mr. Light recognise them? Well, we don't entirely know if Mummy Longlegs has actually seen the player while Playtime Co was active because she doesn't outright say that she's seen them before. So it's possible that she knew that an ex-employee was returning. Someone must have told her. But Mr. Light, on the other hand, she says she does recognise them. Now, Mr. Light and the other variants of her sisters, are the most mysterious experiments in the game. They are teachers specifically made to teach whatever Playtime Co wanted them to teach. But we don't know who they were before being turned into experiments. Were they once teachers who were turned into toy teachers, whether voluntarily or unknowingly? Or are they also orphans who are deemed smart enough to somehow teach other orphans? It's even highly theorized that they are robots because of the weeping angel mechanic and the mysteriousness behind their experimentation. But their need for food wouldn't make sense if they're robots. But if Mr. Light was actually a robot, it wouldn't be entirely impossible that she has some sort of access to the system that stores information of all the Playtime Co employees and recognize their face as one of them. Even if Mr. Light is a human and Mummy Longlegs does recognize the player, does that really mean that the player knew about them as experiments? Well, it is highly likely that most people who were working in the areas these experiments roam know that they are alive and what their deal is. But there's probably some that don't because they didn't need to, like a janitor at the end of the day, as one example. So maybe the player had a role like this in Playtime Co. I mean, it would explain why Mr. Light recognised them and why Mummy Longlegs knew they worked there. And now we reach what I reckon might be the truth. Why does the player feel guilty? And how can guilt be a motivating factor in the player's story? Well, there's many things people feel guilt over that don't involve survivor's guilt and being involved in experimenting on orphans. I think there's just enough substantial proof throughout the game that hints at what exactly the player might feel guilty about, and how that was what drove them to return to the factory. Once again, we need to bring up the letter from the start of the game. Like I've mentioned earlier, it was the information that the other employees were still alive that lured them back. In Chapter 4, we get insights on why they care about their former co-workers enough to go looking for them themselves. The doctor says this:
Was there someone you loved here? Someone you'd lost?
So there was someone that they lost here. Someone who went missing 10 years ago in the Hour of Joy. I remember hearing somewhere that there were 2 days of the week where visitors were allowed in the factory, and the Hour of Joy didn't happen on one of those days. So the only people in the factory were the employees and the orphans. Based on the letter and the fact that the orphans don't have anyone out there, which is why they've ended up in the orphanage, it only makes sense that the player came back for a specific employee they were close to. Maybe it's a family member, a close friend, or even a lover. So putting this line from the doctor together with a letter, it's highly likely that the player was close to another employee who was at the Hour of Joy. Then there's the guilt part, which is likely to be related to this mysterious employee the player came back for. Since this is a theory and we're going off of what's confirmed, we have exactly 0 information on what they feel guilty for, only that they came back for another employee they loved and lost. So what they feel guilty about could be anything. One pretty common example of something that would fit this circumstance is the common trope where character A and character B get into a silly argument. Character A says something they regret and character B leaves for what's supposed to be some hours or so. But tragedy strikes character B and character A lives on to feel heavy guilt that the last thing they did to character B was make them feel awful in the heat of a moment thing, and that they never got the chance to apologise and let them know that they didn't mean it. Now, I'm not saying that this is exactly what happened to the player, but it's a pretty common trope I've seen in stories about guilt that I wouldn't be surprised if I was at least somewhat close. Either way, it's a blank canvas for Mob, and we can only wait to find out why the player feels guilty over this mysterious individual. So, fellow Poppy Playtimers, that's all for this breakdown and mega theory on the player of Poppy Playtime. To recap everything I said, basically the player is very likely to have an actual identity that's yet to be revealed, rather than always being a self-insert based on the crumbs of them having a backstory and actual motivation. If it was a self-insert, their backstory would have to be our own backstory, and we don't have one relating to Playtime Co. The chances of them being someone like Rich is less likely than you'd think, and the chances of them being a toy is almost impossible. And the last thing is that the player's guilt is what motivated them to return to the factory, and that guilt was not born from being the only survivor of the Hour of Joy or experimenting on orphans. Instead, the guilt likely came from a separate incident related to a specific employee, as hinted by Harley Sawyer in Chapter 4 and the letter that Chapter 1 opens with. And this guilt is what motivated them to return to the factory. I know a lot of these takes could be stretches and I might be wrong, but when you have a very important character that's always there, but almost nothing outside of a few clues are known about them, it's almost impossible to make theories about them this deep without making at least a few stretches.